"We didn't invite you," my father said, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. The music stopped feeling like music after that. It just became noise somewhere behind the pounding in my ears as nearly 40 people turned their heads toward me at once. My name is Margaret Whitaker, I'm 67 years old, and that night I was standing in the doorway of a private banquet room at a country club outside Columbus, Ohio, holding a small gift box that suddenly felt much heavier than it should have. The banner over the dance floor read "Happy 40th Anniversary Robert and Elaine," printed in gold script across white fabric, and beneath it my parents were surrounded by relatives, neighbors, and church friends, all smiling and raising glasses. At least they had been smiling until I walked in. I hadn't planned to make a scene. In fact, I had spent the entire 30-minute drive rehearsing what I would say if things felt awkward. I told myself there had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe my invitation had gotten lost in the mail. Maybe Mom assumed my sister had told me. Families make small mistakes like that all the time. But standing there in the doorway, watching my father's expression harden the moment he saw me, I understood that this wasn't a mistake at all. My mother, Elaine Whitaker, slowly lowered the champagne glass in her hand and gave me the same tight smile she used to give when I brought home a report card she didn't like. My younger sister Claire stood beside her, wearing a pale blue dress and the kind of expression people use when they want to pretend they had nothing to do with something. A waiter carrying a tray of sparkling water paused behind me, unsure whether to enter the room or back away. For a few seconds no one said anything, and I thought about turning around, walking back through the hallway, and driving the 12 miles back to my quiet little house. That would have been the easy thing to do. But I had already come too far for easy. I stepped inside, the carpet soft under my shoes, and held up the small white box wrapped with a silver ribbon. "I just came to drop off your anniversary gift," I said as calmly as I could manage. My voice sounded steady, which surprised even me. My father crossed his arms like a man guarding a doorway. "Margaret," he said again, slower this time, "we didn't invite you." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. Across the room, my Aunt Linda whispered something to her husband. I could feel the familiar heat of embarrassment creeping up my neck, the same feeling I'd carried since childhood whenever my parents decided I had disappointed them in some new way. But I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't argue. I simply walked toward the long table where the gifts were stacked in shiny paper and placed my small box among them. "That's okay," I said softly. "You might still want to open this one." For a moment nobody moved after I set the small white box on the table with the other gifts. It looked almost ordinary sitting there among the tall wrapped packages and bright gift bags, but I could feel every pair of eyes in the room shifting between my parents and me as if they were watching the beginning of something uncomfortable. My father let out a quiet breath through his nose, the same way he used to when I was a teenager, and said something he did not approve of. "Margaret," he said again, his voice lower now but still firm, "this is not the time for whatever you think you are doing." My mother finally stepped forward, smoothing the front of her cream-colored dress as if she were trying to smooth the tension out of the air. "You should have called first," she said, her tone carefully polite, the way people speak when they are trying not to look unkind in front of guests. "Tonight is a private family celebration." I almost smiled at that word, family, because nearly everyone in the room was technically family except for me. My sister Claire stood beside the cake table, pretending to rearrange a stack of napkins that did not need rearranging. She avoided looking directly at me, but I noticed the quick glance she gave my father, the silent kind of communication people develop when they have already discussed something ahead of time. A few of the guests began quietly whispering to each other. My Aunt Linda looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy, as if she could not quite decide which emotion was more appropriate. I clasped my hands together to keep them steady. "I am not here to interrupt anything," I said calmly. "I just wanted to drop off the gift and congratulate you both." My father shook his head slowly, like a man who believed he was being extremely patient. "You always say that," he replied. "But somehow you always managed to turn things into a situation." The word situation hung in the air like something fragile that might break if anyone spoke too loudly. I glanced toward the gift table again. The small white box with the silver ribbon looked almost delicate compared to the large wrapped appliances and decorative baskets around it. It had taken me 3 hours to prepare that box earlier that afternoon, sitting at my kitchen table with the sunlight coming through the window and my old clock ticking on the wall. I had thought about not bringing it at all. For a long time I had stared at the documents inside and wondered whether tonight would finally be the right moment. Across the room, one of my cousins cleared his throat and tried to lighten the mood. "Well," he said with a nervous chuckle, "since Margaret is already here, maybe we should just open the gift and get back to the party." A few people nodded in quiet agreement, mostly because no one seemed to know what else to do. My mother hesitated, glancing at my father again. The music from the speakers had started up once more, soft piano notes drifting awkwardly through the room as if the playlist had not realized anything unusual was happening. Finally my father stepped closer to the gift table. He did not pick up the box yet, but he stared at it as if it might suddenly explain itself. "You did not need to bring anything," he said. "A card would have been enough." I gave a small nod. "I know," I answered. "But I thought this might be more useful." My father continued staring at the small white box as if it might somehow explain why I was standing there at all. The silver ribbon reflected the soft lights from the ceiling, and for a moment it was the quietest object in the entire room. Around us people tried to return to their conversations, but their voices sounded cautious, the way people speak when they know something important is unfolding nearby. My mother folded her arms gently, still keeping that polite expression she used whenever she believed someone else was being unreasonable. "Margaret," she said, "you made your point by coming here. You can leave the gift and we will thank you later." Her words were calm, but the message was clear. This was not really my place tonight. I nodded slowly, because in truth I had heard some version of that message most of my life. When I was 16 and wanted to study art instead of accounting, my father told me I was making a mistake. When I moved 300 miles away for my first job, my mother said I was abandoning the family. When I came back years later to help them when the medical bills began piling up, they accepted the help but never quite accepted me. Claire, on the other hand, always seemed to exist in a different version of the same family story. She had stayed close to home, married a man my parents approved of, and visited every Sunday afternoon with homemade desserts and cheerful stories about the neighborhood. Standing there now beside the cake table, she finally looked at me and gave a small shrug as if to say she had no control over what was happening. I did not blame her entirely. Some family roles become so familiar that nobody questions them anymore. My father reached out and lightly tapped the corner of the box with one finger, still not lifting it. "What exactly is inside this thing?" he asked. The question sounded half curious and half suspicious. I kept my voice steady. "Something I thought you might appreciate," I said. "Especially tonight." My mother glanced at the stack of gifts already waiting to be opened later in the evening. Large colorful packages filled the end of the table, many of them from relatives who had traveled hours to be here. Compared to those, my small white box looked almost insignificant. "We can open it later," she suggested quickly, clearly hoping the moment would pass. But by then too many people were watching. My Aunt Linda stepped a little closer to the table, smiling in that friendly way she had always used when family gatherings grew tense. "Oh come on," she said gently. "It is an anniversary party. Opening gifts is part of the fun." A few guests laughed quietly in agreement. The room seemed to lean toward the table all at once. My father hesitated for another second, then finally picked up the box. It was lighter than he expected, and I could see the confusion flicker across his face as he turned it over in his hands. The ribbon slid softly beneath his fingers. "You always had a dramatic streak," he muttered, not quite meeting my eyes. I gave a small smile, because in a way he was right. But tonight was not about drama. It was about timing. I folded my hands again and watched him carefully. "Go ahead," I said calmly. "You might want to see it now." My father finally began to untie the silver ribbon, but he moved slowly, almost cautiously, as if the small white box might contain something fragile or complicated. The room grew quieter again, not completely silent but filled with the soft clinking of glasses and the distant hum of the air conditioning vents above us. I could feel people watching from every direction, waiting for something interesting enough to justify the tension that had settled over what was supposed to be a cheerful anniversary celebration. My mother stepped closer beside my father, her expression carefully neutral, although I noticed the small line that appeared between her eyebrows whenever she felt uncertain. Claire leaned forward slightly from the cake table, curiosity finally overcoming her effort to look uninvolved. The ribbon slipped free in my father's hands and he set it gently on the table before lifting the lid of the box. Inside was a plain cream-colored envelope and a small brass key resting beside it. For a second he did not touch either item. He simply looked down at them, clearly unsure why anyone would wrap something like that as an anniversary gift. "What is this supposed to be?" he asked, glancing up at me with mild irritation. His voice carried easily across the room, and several relatives took another step closer. I kept my voice calm. "Just open the envelope," I said. My father hesitated again, then reached inside the box and lifted the envelope between two fingers. The paper was thick and neatly sealed, the kind people use for important documents rather than greeting cards. My mother leaned closer to read the writing on the front, which simply had both of their names printed in black ink. "Margaret," she said quietly, "this is really not necessary tonight." I met her eyes and gave a small nod. "I know," I replied gently. "But it has been necessary for a long time." He opened the envelope and slid several folded papers out onto the table. At first he only glanced at the top page, and his expression remained confused. Then his eyes moved slowly across the lines of text, and I watched the moment the confusion began to change into something else. His shoulders stiffened slightly. He lowered the papers a few inches, then raised them again as if he wanted to read the first paragraph one more time just to make sure he understood it correctly. My mother noticed the shift in his posture and whispered, "Robert, what is it?" He did not answer immediately. Instead he turned the page carefully, scanning another section of the document. The room around us had become noticeably quieter now. Conversations faded away as more guests realized something unusual was happening at the gift table. My father finally cleared his throat and looked directly at me. "Where did you get these?" he asked. His voice sounded different now, less confident than before. I folded my hands again and answered simply. "From the bank." My mother leaned over his shoulder to read the documents herself, her eyes moving quickly across the printed lines. I saw the exact moment she recognized the address written near the top of the page. It was the address of the house they had lived in for the past 32 years. Her expression shifted from polite patience to quiet disbelief. "Margaret," she said slowly, "what exactly are we looking at?" I took a small breath and looked around the room at the relatives who had gathered close enough to hear every word. Then I returned my gaze to my parents. "You are looking," I said calmly, "at the mortgage records for your house." For a few seconds after I said the words "mortgage records for your house," nobody spoke. My father continued staring at the papers as if the meaning might change if he looked at them long enough. My mother slowly took the top page from his hands and began reading it more carefully, her lips pressing into a thin line as her eyes moved across the printed paragraphs. Around us, several relatives had stepped closer without even realizing it. I could hear my cousin Daniel whispering quietly to his wife somewhere behind me, trying to figure out what exactly was happening. My father finally lowered the remaining documents onto the table and looked directly at me again. "Why are you bringing this up tonight?" he asked. The irritation in his voice had not completely disappeared, but there was something else mixed into it now, a small thread of uncertainty that had not been there earlier when he told me I was not invited. I kept my voice calm because there was no reason to rush the moment. Because tonight seemed like the right time, I answered. My mother looked up from the document and shook her head slightly. These are banking papers, she said. We have had a mortgage for years. Everyone knows that. I nodded. Yes, I replied gently. You have. My father frowned and tapped the top page with one finger. Then why does this say the loan holder changed 6 years ago? He asked. A few people nearby leaned even closer to hear my answer. I folded my hands together again and glanced briefly at the small brass key still resting inside the gift box. Because the bank sold the mortgage, I said. My mother blinked slowly as she processed that information. Banks do that all the time, she replied. It is normal. I nodded again. Yes, it is. I paused for a moment before continuing. But sometimes the buyer is not another bank. My father looked back down at the document, this time reading the section near the bottom of the page where the ownership transfer was printed in bold type. His eyes moved across the line once, then again more slowly. I could see the exact moment when he reached the name printed there. He lifted his head very gradually, as if the weight of the paper had suddenly increased. Margaret, he said carefully, why is your name on this document? The room had become so quiet that the soft piano music from the speakers sounded strangely loud. My mother turned the page toward herself and found the same line. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. That cannot be correct, she murmured. I gave a small, patient smile because I had expected this reaction. It is correct, I said. The bank was preparing to foreclose on the house 6 years ago. The payments had fallen behind for almost 8 months. My mother's eyes widened slightly. That was during your father's surgery, she said quickly, as if explaining something that did not need explaining. We were working things out with the bank. I nodded slowly. Yes, you were trying. My father looked down at the document again, then back at me. What exactly did you do, Margaret? He asked. His voice had become much quieter now. I gestured gently toward the envelope still lying open on the table. I bought the loan, I said simply. I paid the bank the remaining balance and took over the mortgage. Several relatives exchanged surprised looks, and I could hear someone softly whisper the word "what" under their breath. My mother stared at me as if she were seeing a stranger. You are telling us that you bought the mortgage on our house, she said slowly. I nodded once. Yes, I answered. 6 years ago. The word seemed to settle over the room like a slow-moving cloud. For several seconds nobody reacted, as if the idea I had just explained needed time to become real inside their minds. My father looked down again at the papers in his hands, scanning the lines once more as though he hoped he had misunderstood something. My mother continued staring at me, her eyes wide with disbelief. You bought the mortgage, she repeated quietly, almost like she was testing how the sentence sounded out loud. I nodded gently. Yes, I said. My father shifted his weight and cleared his throat. Earlier that evening he had stood tall and certain in the center of the celebration, but now his posture had changed slightly, as if the ground beneath the conversation had become unfamiliar. That does not make any sense, he said slowly. Why would you do something like that without telling us? A few relatives murmured softly behind us, and I noticed my Aunt Linda pressing her hand lightly against her chest as she looked between my parents and me. I kept my voice steady because the truth had never required raised voices. Because at the time you were already under enough stress, I replied. Dad had just come home from the hospital after surgery, and the bank had sent the final notice about the overdue payments. I knew you were trying to work something out with them. My mother shook her head slightly, still struggling to follow the explanation. But we never lost the house, she said quickly. The bank agreed to adjust the payment schedule. I gave a small sympathetic smile. They did adjust it, I said. But only after someone paid the remaining balance on the loan. My father looked up again. You are telling me that you paid the bank the entire remaining mortgage, he said carefully, almost cautiously. At that time it was a little over $180,000, I answered. The number seemed to echo through the room. Someone behind me whispered softly in surprise, and I heard the faint clink of a glass being set down on a nearby table. My father blinked slowly as if he was calculating the amount in his head. "Margaret," he said, his voice noticeably quieter now, "you did not have that kind of money." I allowed myself a small breath before responding. I did not at first, I admitted. But I had savings from the consulting work I did after leaving Chicago, and I sold the lake cabin that Daniel and I used to own before he passed away. At the mention of my late husband's name, several relatives lowered their eyes respectfully. My mother's expression softened for just a moment, then quickly returned to confusion. "You sold the cabin," she said. "You loved that place." I nodded slowly. "I did," I replied. "But I loved the idea of you keeping your home more." My father placed the papers carefully back onto the table beside the open gift box. His fingers rested there for a second as if he needed the surface to steady himself. "So what exactly does this mean?" he asked. "Are you saying you have been collecting the mortgage payments from us for 6 years?" I shook my head gently. "No," I said. "You have not been making payments to anyone." My mother looked startled. "What do you mean we have not been making payments?" she asked quickly. I glanced once more at the brass key inside the box, then back at them. "The loan has been paid in full for years," I explained calmly. "I simply kept the paperwork in my name." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had happened earlier that evening. My father stared at me again, and this time there was no irritation in his eyes at all, only a deep and growing realization that the story of their house had never been exactly what they believed it was. The silence after my explanation felt heavier than anything that had happened earlier that evening. My father looked down again at the documents on the table, then back at me, as if he were trying to decide whether he had heard correctly. My mother slowly placed the papers back into the envelope but did not seal it, her hands moving more carefully than before. Around us, the guests had completely stopped pretending to continue the party. Conversations had faded away, and nearly everyone in the room was now quietly watching the three of us. My sister Claire finally stepped forward from the cake table, her voice hesitant. "Margaret," she said softly, "are you serious right now?" I turned slightly toward her and nodded once. "Yes," I answered calmly. "I am." She glanced at our parents, clearly searching for some kind of explanation that would make the situation simpler. "You mean the house has been paid off this whole time?" she asked. "And you did it without telling anyone?" I gave a small shrug. "There did not seem to be much point in announcing it," I said. My father let out a slow breath and rested both hands on the edge of the table. The earlier confidence in his posture had disappeared completely now. "Margaret," he said quietly, "that is not a small thing to keep secret." I understood what he meant, but the truth was that I had spent many years learning that certain things did not need an audience. "It was never meant to be a secret," I replied. "It was just something that needed to be handled." My mother looked at the brass key still resting inside the gift box. "And the key?" she asked. "What is that supposed to represent?" I followed her gaze and reached forward to gently pick it up. The small piece of metal felt cool against my fingers. "It is a spare key to the house," I explained. "The one the bank gave me when the paperwork was finalized." My father frowned slightly. "Why would the bank give you a key?" he asked. I held the key up for a moment before setting it carefully on the table beside the documents. "Because when the loan was transferred, I said evenly, the property technically became mine until the title was reassigned." My mother blinked slowly again, clearly trying to absorb every word. "Are you saying you own the house?" she asked. I paused for a second before answering because the truth was both simple and complicated at the same time. "For the last 6 years," I said calmly, "the house has legally been in my name." A quiet ripple of surprise moved through the small crowd of relatives nearby. Someone whispered something to another guest, and I heard the soft rustle of people shifting their weight on the carpet. My father stared at the documents again as if hoping the ink might rearrange itself into a different explanation. "But we have been living there," he said slowly. "We have been maintaining it, paying the utilities, everything." I nodded. "Yes, you have," I replied. "And that is exactly how I wanted it." My mother looked at me with an expression that was no longer defensive but deeply confused. "Then why bring this up tonight?" she asked. "After all this time, why choose our anniversary party?" I met her eyes calmly because the answer to that question had been forming in my mind for months. "Because tonight," I said gently, "I originally planned to give the house back to you as a gift." The words hung in the air like a sudden change in weather, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath waiting for what I would say next. The moment I said I originally planned to give the house back to you as a gift, the room seemed to lose what little movement it still had. My father stood completely still, his hands resting on the edge of the table as though the words had quietly taken the strength out of them. My mother looked at me in a way I had not seen before, not with irritation or disappointment, but with a slow realization that something important had already changed long before tonight. My sister Claire was the first to speak again, her voice softer than before. "You were going to give them the house tonight?" she asked carefully. I nodded once. "That was the plan," I said. I had already prepared the title transfer documents. "They are inside the envelope under the mortgage records." My father looked down quickly and opened the envelope again, flipping through the papers with slightly unsteady fingers. When he reached the final page, he stopped. The document was clearly labeled Property Title Transfer, and the signature line for the new owners was still blank. My mother leaned closer to read it, her expression tightening with every word. Around us several relatives shifted again, clearly realizing that what they were witnessing had just become much bigger than a simple family disagreement. My father slowly placed the papers back on the table and looked at me again. "You were planning to give this to us tonight," he said quietly. I nodded. "Yes," I answered. 40 years of marriage seemed like a meaningful moment. My mother swallowed and glanced around the room before lowering her voice slightly. "Then why say you originally planned to do that?" she asked. "Why use the past tense?" I felt the weight of that question settle gently between us, and for a moment I allowed myself to look around the room as well. The decorations, the anniversary banner, the tables full of smiling photographs from their life together, all of it had been meant to celebrate family. I finally looked back at them and spoke calmly. "Because when I walked into this room tonight," I said, "the first thing I heard was that I was not invited." My father's shoulders lowered slightly. My mother opened her mouth as if to respond, then closed it again. I continued speaking in the same steady tone. "I understand that families have disagreements," I said. "I understand that sometimes people feel frustrated with each other. But hearing my own father say those words in front of an entire room full of relatives made something very clear to me." Claire shifted uncomfortably beside the cake table, and a few guests quietly looked down at the floor. "Margaret," my father began slowly, "that was not meant to be." I raised one hand gently, not to interrupt him rudely but simply to finish my thought. "It showed me that I had misunderstood something important," I said. "I believed that helping protect the house meant I was still part of the home. Tonight I realized those are not always the same thing." The room remained silent as I reached forward and carefully placed the title transfer document back inside the envelope. I slid the papers neatly together and closed the flap before setting the envelope back into the small white gift box beside the brass key. My mother watched the movement with wide eyes. "Margaret," she said quietly, "what are you doing?" I looked at both of them calmly and answered with the same gentle voice I had used all evening. "I am putting the gift away." I closed the lid of the small white box slowly, making sure the envelope and the brass key rested neatly inside before I placed the silver ribbon back across the top. No one tried to stop me. The room was so quiet that I could hear the soft hum of the ceiling lights and the faint clatter of dishes from somewhere in the kitchen down the hallway. My mother stared at the box as if it were something fragile that might disappear if she blinked too long. My father looked older than he had an hour earlier, his shoulders slightly lowered, his hands still resting on the edge of the table where the documents had been spread only moments before. My sister Claire shifted a step closer and spoke carefully, as if choosing each word with great caution. "Margaret," she said, "you do not have to make a decision like this tonight." I looked at her and gave a small, gentle smile. "Actually," I said quietly, "tonight is exactly when the decision became clear." My father finally straightened a little and rubbed his hand across his forehead, something he always did when he was trying to think through a complicated situation. "We did not mean for things to happen like this," he said slowly. "You showing up tonight caught us by surprise." I nodded once because that part was probably true. "I believe you," I answered. But the surprise was not the problem. My mother looked at me again, her voice softer than before. "Margaret, you are our daughter," she said. "Of course you are part of this family." I considered those words for a moment before responding. "Families show that in many ways," I said gently. "Sometimes in words, sometimes in small invitations." No one argued with that. I reached for the gift box and held it lightly in both hands. It did not feel heavy anymore. In fact, it felt strangely simple, like something that had finally found its proper weight. I looked around the room once more at the relatives, the anniversary banner, the decorated tables, and the long history that filled every corner of the place. Then I turned back to my parents. "You have built a long life together," I said calmly. 40 years is something worth celebrating." My father nodded slowly, but he did not speak. I continued in the same steady tone. "And you will always have the memories in that house," I said. "But the house itself will remain in my name for now." My mother's eyes widened slightly again, though this time she did not argue. I stepped back from the table, still holding the box. "You are welcome to continue living there exactly the way you have been," I added gently. "Nothing about tonight changes that." My father looked at me carefully. "And the papers?" he asked quietly. I gave a small shrug. "They will stay where they are," I replied. "Inside the box." For a moment none of us moved. Then I turned toward the doorway I had entered earlier that evening. As I began walking across the room, the crowd slowly parted to give me space. No one tried to stop me. When I reached the doorway, I paused for just a second and glanced back at the celebration that had grown so quiet behind me. Then I stepped into the hallway and continued toward the exit, the small white box resting calmly in my hands.